Chapter 5, the View Transitions API. Animations have been a part of the web experience for a long time, but it's never been particularly easy to create an immersive experience. While we've come a long way from the days of the marquee tag and animated under construction GIFs, the web is still a bit behind its native peers. It's simple enough to move things around on a single web page with CSS, but it gets a lot harder when you try to animate between multiple pages. You end up using a lot of JavaScript if you want to achieve any kind of continuity. So the Chrome team have developed a new web standard called the View Transitions API to try to make things easier. And while it seamlessly integrates into single-page applications, it also has some exciting implications for multi-page applications. So let's start by discussing the basics of CSS animations and transitions. I'll include a link down below if you want to skip ahead to the View Transitions part. We'll start with CSS Transitions. So it's just a simple way to declaratively tell the browser that I have this thing and I have it in two different states. You can do more, but it gets hard to juggle whenever you're in multiple states because, as you can see, it's just a matter of putting the class on and taking it off. And then the browser will automatically interpolate between the states. So as you can see, we just click on the button and it goes in between. And so this can be multiple views on a single page application. It can be that simple, but it gets a little bit difficult to do multiple things on the same page depending on, you need everything to be tied to your central router, and it needs to be applying these classes and taking off all of these classes. So CSS transitions are pretty fantastic in terms of doing like reactions to a user interaction and just doing a simple switch between two states. But what if you want to do something more complex or have the animation continue more than one time? I mean, I don't know if it's the best idea for web design these days, but you can have animations that go for infinite amount of times if you just use CSS animations, which I'm showing off here. And I'm also showing off how to use CSS custom properties right here. Makes it really simple if you want to share things between multiple items, and it's really fantastic what you can do with CSS these days. I'm just going to move quickly through this, but it just shows what you can do really easily here. And I'm going to show off this really absurd, overly complex animation from later just to show exactly what you can do with keyframes and animations. You can really get specific in terms of what you want to happen and when. So it gives you a lot more flexibility than a simple transition. And now we begin the cat galleries. There are 4 of these throughout this video. I love cats, get over it. The first one is a simple CSS transition. And so if we're not going to change over to a whole different web page, sometimes a transition that you just let the browser take care of the animation for you, this can be the right answer in a lot of situations because look at how smooth that can be. And so this is generally what I reach for in terms of simple animations between two states. But if you want to do a little bit crazier animation where different things happen to different elements on the page, then I would reach for a CSS animation like this. And so this would also be more effective for changing between different web pages. So if you want to have a link to one kitty cat page, then you could have this animate in between these two states. But that's pretty hard to do on a multi-page application. This would be simple enough on a single-page application. I haven't done the routing logic here, but I do it later. But in a multi-page application, it gets a lot harder to get these smooth animations between states. So let's take a look at a couple ways that people do that. So the simplest easy way to do is something like this where you fade in and out of each page. We're just intercepting each link, and then we're doing this silly little function I found off Stack Overflow. And it's not bad, but do you want your entire page fading in and out? You don't really get any continuity of this is supposed to be the same elements. I don't know. So what you can do is you can try to do calculations based on 2 elements, because what if these had like certain amounts of text? We don't know how much is going to be inside it, what size and shape it's going to be. Well, you can do a calculation based on each element, how it's going to be at the beginning and at the end, first and last. You invert it, you do some calculations. I'm not the best at explaining it. There's an article you can click on right here, and there's a great article by David Khorshid on CSS tricks. And the idea is that you make calculations based on the size and shape of each thing. And here I'm just storing it in local storage, and this is not great, but the idea is the same, is that you can do a kind of smooth JavaScript animation in between each element. And these are 2 different web pages, but each one has an animation into the other, where it seems like you have a little bit of continuity with each item because we have saved the size and shape in local storage in this case. But in single page applications, it's a lot easier. But I just wanted to show that this could extend to multi-page applications as well. I don't want to go too far off topic, but I want to talk about why it's hard to transition things between states on a multi-page application like Amazon here. So you can see we have all of these requests. We've downloaded all of this stuff, but whenever we click on this, we've disabled the cache. We're on slow free G. So the browser is going to throw all of that away, and it's going to make some new requests and download all of these new style sheets and a bunch of new HTML markup, and it's going to build a new DOM and a new CSS OM. And you saw we have a blank screen there for a second because it's building up an entirely new web page for us here. Now things like caching headers and fast internet, like it makes it pretty hard to notice things like this, and it makes it a lot smoother these days. But wouldn't it be nice? I mean, that picture still hasn't loaded. I mean, even if you could take a picture of that and then we could move the picture over to a new place on the screen whenever the new web page loads in, wouldn't that be nice? Well, you can with the View Transitions API. All right, we're finally here, the View Transition API. As you can see, as of right now, it's only available in Chromium browsers, but hopefully Safari and Firefox get on this soon because it's just so exciting. So we're going to start with the simplest single-page application possible here, and we are going to have a static header and footer, and when you click this button, we're going to substitute the view in the middle here, and you'll see when we click this button, we get a nice little crossfade here. And so let's look at all the CSS that's necessary to get that crossfade, and there's absolutely no CSS that's necessary to get that crossfade. Everything is commented out, and this is the standard behavior of the browser when you use the one method involved here, the start view transition method, which is available on the document. And so what this takes is a function that returns a way of updating the DOM. And so as you can see right here, we're just substituting the two views, and what this means is that you get a whole view transition here. And like I said, we didn't define any CSS, so we get, this is the Great Explainer by Jake Archibald right here, and you'll see that we get this root view transition group, which contains an image pair, which has an old and a new image. So it's an old screenshot and then a live representation of the new DOM. And that's important. We'll see that later. So let's look at the W3 spec really quickly, and you'll see that this is how we get that crossfade. Automatically on the view transition group, we have a duration of 250 milliseconds. And then over here, we just have the view image pair has position absolute inset 0, blah, blah, blah. You can look at the spec if you want to look at this closer, but here is the standard fade out and the standard fade in. And if we look down here, you can see that it takes a snapshot of the entire DOM. It's literally a screenshot of the old image and then a live representation of the new image. But something that this means is that if we don't define anything and if we don't opt any parts of the DOM out, it's going to take a screenshot of the whole DOM, which means that as I click this button, we're not updating it, I'm mashing it. We should be getting more updates than this. But because the entire DOM is covered for 250 milliseconds, I actually cannot interact with it. So all we have to do is define a few CSS rules to help the browser understand how we want this view transition to work. And this is all based around one single CSS property, the viewTransitionName. And so you can call this anything you want, but it's often handy to give it the same name as the CSS selector that you're targeting, because this gives you access to a whole pseudo selector tree here. And remember, we already have one of these called root in the browser whenever we do a view transition. Now we have one called main content. And remember, all of these have that standard behavior that we saw in the spec, that fade out and fade back in. And so what we can do is we can target each one of these that we want to. We can even just target the root if we don't want to give any view transition names and have the whole thing have one animation that we choose, or we can target just one of these with one view transition name, and we can have that one specific thing do whatever we want. So if we want the new representation of a DOM to slide in over the course of 1 second from the bottom 100%, then what we can do is just give it the view transition new pseudo selector these simple rules, and everything else is still going to behave the same. The old representation of a DOM is still going to fade out while the new one slides in from the bottom. So let's save this and check it out, and we can see here that, oh, yep, the old one fades out out, the new one slides in. So you can give as many view transition names as you want and define each element of a DOM however you want. The important thing is that you can only give one view transition name to one element in the DOM at a time, because the browser needs to know how to interpolate between them. So like for instance, this footer here, we notice how it fades out and fades back in. We can select it with a view transition name. And when we save this, you're going to see instead of fading out and fading back in, now that we've given it a view transition name, it's going to take that element and slide it down to the bottom for us. Just like a CSS transition, it gives us this automatic behavior where it just interpolates it between the two positions. Really cool, really awesome. And so the thing is about this though, the browser needs to know what element it is selecting so it can slide it between them. So if there are multiple elements, then it's going to break the whole transition because the browser's like, I don't know what to move where, how is this supposed to work? So that's the important thing. Only ever give one thing in the DOM, one view transition name, and that's the best way to have the expected behavior that you want, and it's going to work the way you want. But here's one thing about this. We can't click on this button for that whole second that this is transitioning in, and that's just some frustrating behavior, let me tell you what. But it's really easy to fix this. Check this out. All we have to do is remember that is the root element. We're gonna take that out. So this can be HTML, but it can also be, if you're trying to do a more like generally you want it to be the whole page, but you can select further down and say more things that you want to have a view transition name of none. So this is whatever you want to opt out of the animation. So this is the only name that you can give to multiple elements is none. And then that is going to opt out that of that part for the animation. So if we give it to the root element, then that whole root is taken out of the animation. So it's not going to animate, but if we want to be able to click, we have to target this view transition pseudo selector. So remember, at the very top of all of these is this one pseudo selector, view transition. And that contains all of our groups. It's got that root group we talked about, and it's got all these other groups, the footer group and the main content group. And now that we have opted that out of having pointer events none, then now we can click underneath of it. And even though it's covering the whole DOM, we can still click here, and it's going to be able to still interact with the DOM as the view transition is happening, and you can make new view transitions happen, and it's just going to cancel the old one and make a new view transition. And with this, you can do whatever you want. It's really, really incredible. I am just in love with this API. Let's go through some more examples. So remember, this only works in Chromium browsers for right now. So for users in Firefox and Safari, this button just doesn't do anything right now. So let's look at the spec to think about how we can fix this. So we have this one method, startViewTransition, which takes in one function that is called asynchronously, and we are given a viewTransition interface. And so what that means is that we have 3 promises and one method here. The 3 promises, the first one resolves whenever that function that you give it is done. So if you give it something to fetch from a server far away and it takes a little bit, you can do something in between, set up a spinner and resolve that whenever that callback is done. And then when you get the next promise, ready, that is when the view transition is ready to go from the old state to the live representation of the new state. And so when that promise resolves, you then next can have the finished promise that resolves whenever you have finished transitioning to that new state. And then finally, we have the skip transition method. And with the skip transition method, we can use the view transition API as a progressive enhancement. Instead of relying on it to do everything and have animations everywhere no matter what, we can rely on this method to still update the DOM even if we can't do the animations. So we can have a media query or something like that, and the skip transition method will still take us from the old DOM to the new DOM without the animation in between. And so Jake Archibald, in his incredible explainer, has this really handy transitionHelper function. And with this, it takes in an object with 3 parameters. And it has that skip transition, but by default it's false. And then next we have these class names. You can put in an array of however many class names you want. And then finally, a function to update the DOM. So if skip transition is true, then that means you pass in the transition helper with that, or the method has been called in some way, you have a media query. If that is true, or if document.startViewTransition is undefined, that means that the method is not available, so you're in a browser where that is not in the global scope. So that means, if either of those are true, then we want update callback done to be a promise that resolves when this function that we pass in is done. And then we are going to also return an interface with the promise that rejects, saying that view transitions are unsupported, and just in case you want to use that error in the DOM somehow. And then we also have update callback done, and which is just going to be that function that we passed in, and which finished, which resolves with that, and then skip transition, which, if we pass in something, then it's going to be true. And so, like, if we want to do a special thing to the DOM while we're skipping the transition, we can pass it in there as well. And so at the end here, if the view transitions are supported and we're not skipping the transition, then we're going to add those class names that we passed into the transition helper. We're going to add them to the DOM. Then we're going to make the transition, and we're going to say that with that transition, when it's finished, we want to take those class names off of the DOM. And so you can edit this to be whatever you want, but by default, this transition helper is just saying, let's do it to the whole DOM. And then we're going to return that transition. So you can still do whatever you want, have access to the full interface, and say whatever you want to do when the promise is ready, whenever the promise is resolved, or whatever you want to do if you're skipping the transition, if that media query is true, whatever you want. And you have these free promises and the method, which you can redefine if you want to. And it's really, really handy. I'm going to use this transition helper in the rest of my demos. So we have our second demo here. It's just an enhanced version of the first one, where we apply all these crazy classes to the body with the colors changing everywhere. And we have this blue outline here and a darker color background back there. And when we do prefers reduce motion, we can actually refresh this and the DOM will still be updated. And over here in Firefox, which doesn't support View Transitions API, we can still have a little bit of animation and update the DOM. And we could even put this error message in there somewhere if we wanted to. So, I mean, it's pretty cool how this all works. I would say that's almost a polyfill. And so let's take a look at the code and see how this works. So as you might have guessed by now, I'm not the best designer or programmer, but I'm just showing how even somebody like me can take these things and build stuff with it. So I start out here by opting out the majority of a document from the view transition so I can click on stuff willy-nilly and be silly. Then here's my bad CSS, and then just right here I'm defining a view transition name of Scoot, and then I'm showing how you can target each part of it and do whatever you want. The dark background came from me targeting the view transition group. That blue border came from me targeting the view transition image pair. And then I'm just doing a little bit of mixed blend overflow. That's just to make the animation a little bit smoother. And then down here, I am defining the old animation to be a reverse version of this keyframe, and then the new animation to be the forwards version of this keyframes. And then down here is a body class, which is going to get this animation, which is the crazy background animation that you saw there. And down here, I am just naively replacing skip transition with a media query that matches prefers reduce motion. That's how I did that. I mean, I'm just showing how you can pass that in and how the function will work. Obviously, you should probably do the media query in the CSS, but I'm just showing how you can put this in with the transition helper. So I'm defining skip transition with that. So instead of it being false like it is normally, it's going to be that. And then the class names that we're passing into the transition is that body class with the crazy background. And then we're doing the same update of a DOM, which is just going to be what we would pass into document.startViewTransition. And then down here, afterwards, we are going to handle the animation with that transition that we pass in on the button. And I'll show you how that works. And then down here is the transition helper. I don't really change this at all. It's almost exactly the same, except I put some console logs, and I'm showing how you can put things on the promises as you're doing it. And at the very end is this handle animation function where I'm doing the web animation API stuff here. I mean, I'm not great at this stuff, but I'm just made a function where I'm passing in the transition and the element. And if we're skipping the transition, then we do that. So that just shows how you can use these things even if you're not great at doing stuff like me, and you can build anything you want. It's really, really easy. So Jake Archibald made this really fantastic demo, and I'm just going to show it because there's no point in making my own because it makes it really clear. So remember how I said that the view transition old is just a screenshot, and the view transition new is a live representation of the DOM. So what if you want to use something like a video in your view transition? So we're going to extend it for 5 seconds to really make this clear. And so as we have this video playing, we're going to slow it down and bring it down to the bottom. And you look, there's the screenshot for half the time, and you can't see what's happening. It's behind my head, but we'll do it again right there. And so you can see it's not the live video the whole time. And so what you can do instead is that you want to not display the old view transition, but you don't want to animate the new one. You don't want to fade it in. You just want it playing the whole time. And when you do this slowly, you'll see that when it comes back up behind my head, it is the video the whole time. And let me scroll down and click it again so you can see the video keeps playing. It's never paused. So this is how you want to animate a view transition with a video. And all he had to do was define a few view transition names and a few selectors. It's 40 lines of CSS, 44 lines of JavaScript. He just has these toggles and the simple form of his transition helper, and then some normal, video elements and stuff. It's so cool. It's all so simple, so easy to build great things on the web these days. And I really recommend this Jazzy Emu video if you haven't seen it. It's quite silly. And so we get back to the cat pictures. And the idea behind this is that we're trying to build this dynamically. We're getting our pictures from an API or something. We don't know how many we're going to get. So we had to build this gallery dynamically, but we still want to use view transitions. So just to make a point, I'm not going to have any specific animation at first. We're just going to use the browser defaults. And so we build the gallery, and a naive way to do this would just be give them all the same view transition name. But remember, the problem is only one thing can have the view transition name at a time. So the animation gets completely broken if we try to do it that way. But if we refresh and we try to maybe give it the source of each image, and use that, and this kind of works. This is not the worst idea. But the problem with this is that you see how the animation isn't really the best. We get these kind of ghostly things, and we kind of want to adjust the aspect ratio and stuff like that. Well, to do that, we're going to have to actually use those pseudo selectors that we talked about before, and it's really, really hard to select those with JavaScript. Really hard. I have a version over here that I did with StackBlitz where I use this iffy to try to bring in a new style sheet, and it does all this work to try to select them, and it almost works. It really almost works, but the problem with it is that I'm trying to do a 10-second duration here just to really show it off, and I don't know if something's broken. I mean, this just isn't the way to do it. So let me show you the way to do it. So if they can't all share a view transition name, and it's really hard to customize them whenever we make it on the fly, then what do? Well, this is going to be in response to the user interaction anyways. So we can just conditionally create the view transition name whenever the image is clicked on, and then take it off whenever the user clicks on it again, because it's going to be taking up the majority of the screen. And so if we do it this way instead, remember we still haven't customized the animation at all, but we still have these nice animations whenever we do it, and it just takes off the class whenever we click again. And so next thing that we can do is that we can now customize this animation because we know exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be what we call active whenever we click on it. And so then if we customize it to take off the animation and just have it focus on the new image, then when we refresh, we could have this nice smoother transition. And so that's how you can conditionally apply view transition names. And so our final cat gallery is just a fully optimized version using the View Transitions API. As you can see, we have different animations for the active image coming in and going out. And then we also have animations for the gallery that slides out and then it fades back in. And then if we had something behind here, we could actually opt that out as well, because here we have the body with the view transition name of none. And down here we have the gallery giving its own view transition name. And then we know where that active view transition name is going to go. It's going to go on the image. So we're just going to go ahead and put it there beforehand. So I just wanted to show you how you can conditionally apply view transition names. And so down here, we have the gallery getting the move right when it's the view transition old and the fade in when it's view transition new. And the active image gets move right when it's the view transition old, and a different one called activate when it's the view transition new. And so you can see I've got it all defined right down here, and then we conditionally do it whenever we click on it, just like before. And then down here is our transition helper. So yeah, that is the final cat gallery. So we've seen how the View Transitions API makes it a lot easier to define the animations for what comes in and what goes out for each element. But, I mean, all of this was kind of possible with CSS and JavaScript and single-page applications before. What's really, really exciting with the View Transitions API is that it also works on multi-page applications. They haven't got it perfect just yet, but if you just put this meta tag on here, meta name view transition, content, same origin, the same website. And so we have index and other here. And we have two view transition names. So we're telling the browser that these two elements are the same. So we don't have to do a flip animation or anything. That is literally it. No JavaScript whatsoever. And watch this. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's like kind of crazy. You can do this with no JavaScript, with only the browser knowing which items you're saying from the CSS, which items are supposed to be the same, and you click, and sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does, and it's pretty cool. So Rich Harris has this really fantastic talk where he talks about multi-page apps, single-page apps, frameworks, the edge, a lot of stuff. It's a really great talk. I really respect him. But he had this part where he talks about the View Transitions API, and he talks about something that would still be impossible on a multi-page app. And he talks about a survey with a number tweening in between steps as an example of something that would be impossible. But I kind of end up challenging him on Twitter, and I just said something here, and I was like, I don't know, there might be some ways around this if you know what you're doing. And I made this really bad demo. Don't look at it too closely. It's really bad. But he calls me out on it being bad, and I was like, maybe Jake Archibald could do something better. And of course he could. He makes this really, really incredible demo. But the thing about it is that it's still a single page application, like this guy says. And so I took the demo, his much better code in CSS, and I went and I put the meta tag on it, and it's sort of kind of works. I put a little bit of bad JavaScript on there, and look at that. Like, it's incredible what you can do. And I'm really excited. Like, what better designers, as they perfect the implementation and in browsers, this is going to really blur the line between MPAs and SPAs. Like, you can do a lot more. And I'm really excited about how this is going to challenge people's perceived limitations. So let's think about ways we can use the View Transitions API in our app. So we have this main area, and we can load things in asynchronously with the spinner that we bring in after 300 milliseconds, but it's still kind of jarring. And so what if we just slide everything in from right to left in this main area of the screen? And let's think about what's going to persist. The header and the footer are going to be there on every page, so we should take them out of the view transition altogether and make sure people can still click on links. And then the image, remember the Amazon example, how we had to wait for the image to load even though it was the same image? And it's kind of bad design here, how you can only see like one or two items at a time because these images are so big. let's have the images be smaller on this screen, and then if the user clicks on it, it's going to grow to become this size on this screen. And we can make more things persist too. Like some of these pages have titles, but some don't. Let's put titles on every screen, and then we can have the browser move those titles around for us. And maybe with the products, we'll put a little line on top of them so it looks a little bit cooler when they slide in and out of the screen. And with the checkout, it's pretty boring like this, and we don't have great error handling or anything. What if we make it a lot more responsive to the user by using the ViewTransitions API? So I just want to clarify before we get into this that this probably should be done with normal CSS and JavaScript. The ViewTransitions API should probably be done with like actual transitions between pages. But I'm just going to show that, you could do this with normal CSS and JavaScript. I know how to do that. I'm just going to show it with the ViewTransitions API for the sake of it. Let's get into it. All right, let's look at the finished product really quickly before we get into the code so you know what we're talking about. We have the active step right here. When we run the update DOM function, it's going to be able to check the state of the form, and it can respond, and everything can happen all at once, and we can coordinate everything together so that if you're going forward, it's going to be that color. If you go backwards, it is that color. That things are going in a certain direction. We have error handling. We can do that. We can type while the error is there. We can do that. We can go forwards, and we'll go forwards all the way to the end just so you can see that. Don't you dare go back. And we have a final blue background. And let's go check out the code. So let's start off with the CSS here, and we're just going to focus on the view transition stuff. And you'll see the key is giving almost everything its own little view transition name here so we can focus on it when we do the transition. And the form step is going to start off with sliding left, assuming that we're going to proceed forward in the form. And then each button gets its own view transition name because, as you can see, they slide over to adapt to where they're supposed to be. And then we have the progress bar and the progress number, which each get their own view transition name so we can customize the animation. And then down here, we have these error transition, back transition, success transition. These are going to be conditionally applied by our transitionHelper function with that class names property. And I'll show you that later. And then here we're customizing the animation. We want the progress bar to persist, and we want the progress number. We don't want to see the old one, so that's what we're doing there. And we want to mix blend. I can't explain this very well, unfortunately. The Archibald explainer has an explainer about this. And then we are sliding left at first, and then we are putting these borders right here with the old transition. And as you can see, the green, the dark, that's what's surrounding it as it slides out in each direction. And here is the error message view transition. And then down here, we are putting the opacity at 50% because everything's involved in the view transition here. So these buttons are not going to be you can't use the buttons while the view transition is happening. So you might as well make them opacity 50%. Let the user know you can't do anything with these buttons. And then down here, we define all our animations. Very, very simple stuff. And now let's look at the JavaScript. So we define the buttons and stuff. With the buttons, they're all going to have their own event handlers where we conditionally apply which direction it should slide. They each get their own view transition name. So you saw how we did the view transition name conditional application earlier. And we have transitionHelper here where we bring in those class names like I talked about. And then down here, we are going to show the animate number. That's its own thing to help us know what number we're on. And then the show error gets its own transition. And down here, we are going to have our transitionHelper, very simple, the way it has been. And the update DOM function just tells us like which buttons are supposed to be here, what form step are we on, so it can give it the active class, and what number we should be animating to, where the progress bar should be. And all of it just works together, and it's pretty cool. Like I said, should this be a view transition? I'm not sure. That's what we're going to have to be figuring out as time goes on. But let's look at the finished version of our app really quickly before we wrap up. All right, so here we are in our app with the View Transitions API. I'm going to refresh the home page and whoop, it slides right in. And then we go over here, and as you can see, the title persists and it moves itself across. And then we go over to products, and it's going to load up there with the slider, everything's sliding in and out. We click on this product, and there it comes. And then if we go over to our checkout, I have to add an item to the cart. So let's add that item. And then when we go over to the cart, we can see that I have put our little multi-step form in here. And so the question is, what should and shouldn't be a view transition? I know one thing is I added this little hamburger menu over here. Something like this should probably not really be a view transition. I mean, in my opinion, but maybe it should. Could be. So I'm not going to get too deep into this, but I'm just going to go over this quickly. You can read the article if you want to have a better idea of how this all works. But we had this render function, and that's what's changing out the inner HTML of the main area here. And so we're just going to change it around a little bit. And we're going to start off with this whole active class thing. This is for the images, so that we know which image that we want to grow like that as we go in between the screens. Down here, we do this thing where we listen for what we're clicking on, see if it's an image or a title, and then we define the view transition name as an active image if that is the case. And then we define another image, the first one we defined on this screen, as the active image. And so now in our render function, first we are adding our old active class if we can. We're checking to see if there's a clicked image. If there's not, then we don't worry about it. And then we run our transition helper because now we have that with the active view transition name. And then in here we are seeing if we should run our 404. This is just a double check. We are also doing this in the routes function. And then down here we are doing the inner HTML is the component. We're scrolling to the top if we need to. There are multiple ways to do this. This might not be the best. We are adding our active class, and then we are adding any event listeners that we need for our new page. And it's really that simple. That takes care of the entire view transition. And then other than that, it's a matter of what we give view transition names in the CSS. So you can see here we want to do view transition name of none on the root, so we can click on the links. And we also do a pointer events none somewhere else. And then we're giving each thing, the nav and the footer have a view transition name of none as well, just to be sure of that. They don't get affected by view transitions. We give the main area a view transition name, so we can manipulate the we give the main area a view transition name so we can manipulate the animations there. And then it's a matter of giving the H1 its own view transition name, the form gets its own view transition name, and then the CSS is pretty simple from there. A lot of pseudo selector work. That's what you're going to be doing most of the time here. You're going to see these double colons a lot. And you can look at the code more if you want a better explanation of how it all works. But let's move on. To wrap things up, I just want to show two more demos really quickly. This is a version of our app from a future chapter where we build it with Astro as a multi-page application. And look, the animations still work. I mean, you don't need a single page application to build this kind of thing anymore. And look at this. We have that load in like that. These are whole new pages. It's loading in new style sheets and everything. And then we have that persist. It's not perfect. I'm not the best designer, and they're still working on perfecting the multi-page version of the View Transitions API. But it's really exciting how this is going to kind of blend that barrier between multi-page applications and single-page applications. You get almost everything you got out of a single-page application with this app. And so you might say, okay, but nobody builds multi-page applications anymore. Everybody's building stuff with React. Well, I built a React router that uses the View Transitions API. So look, we even have some state over here, and then we have an animation for our central area here. We're retaining our state. We can keep pressing that button. It's still staying hydrated. Now, I think this should probably be done with usync external store, but I couldn't get it to work quite right. But what we're doing here is we have our app. We set the path with the path name from the location API, so just whatever's in the address bar. And then we have this component that starts out as null. And we have a navigation listener. We're doing use callback on the navigate event which we talked about in the last chapter with the navigation API. You can go look at that. And so here we are intercepting the event and starting the view transition with the path. And so down here we have our listener that we're doing with some use callbacks, so we can add them on and take them off with a use effect. I mean, I don't know how good this all is. All I know is that this works, okay? And it's like only like 50 lines of code there, and then we have a suspense with a loading fallback here, and then the component, and then we're even dynamically importing the components here. And so the way that all of this works out is that we actually even get like code splitting and stuff here, and I'm even loading in special like meta tags for each thing. Like, so if we go over here and we look at the head, you can see that this is a cat meta tag here, and then I go through and I actually edit the meta tags. So yeah, I built a bit of a React framework here based on view transitions. I don't think it's very good, but it's pretty cool what you can do. That's the navigation API, the view transitions API. They work hand in hand, and you can build anything with this. I've said it a couple times now, I'm not the best, but like, it's incredible what you can do with these new web APIs. And whether it be a multi-page application or a single page application, you can make all these immersive experiences now, and it's built into the browser. And I guess that's really the moral of the story with all of this whole thing that I'm doing here, is that these the web standards are getting incredible, and they're really easy to work with, and this stuff is getting more accessible than ever. And so we're going to keep exploring this as I continue this series, and I think that it's just going to be really exciting as we try to figure out where these lines are in terms of what should be a multi-page application, what should be a single-page application. Do those names even mean anything anymore? I mean, what's the point whenever you can do almost all of the same things either way? So why not just optimize for your use case and stop worrying about putting your application into some sort of predefined box? And I guess that's the moral of the story. Thank you for watching if you watched this whole thing.